prayer of the church continues to remember the baptized, those who are confirmed, as the opening prayer has mentioned, that the beginnings of the church, the beginnings of faith. And so always during Eastertide, there's a particular emphasis on the baptized. It is the season of being baptized, really. And most excellently on the Easter Vigil, that Easter Vigil liturgy where baptism also takes place. And so still until the time of the Ascension, we're going to be hearing always this reference to those who have just received your word, to those who have just taken the faith that they may persevere, and so forth, in order that we keep on recalling the newly baptized. But also in the time of Easter, we're hearing from the Acts of the Apostles, exactly what happens after the resurrection of the Lord and after the ascension of the Lord. This is properly the time to reflect on that. And just as we remember the newly baptized and the new Christians, we also remember the church forming, the newly formed church after Pentecost. And one of the things that comes out that we hear in this reading, the first reading in particular, is what is known as traditionally the first church council, the Council of Jerusalem. There was a question that had to be discerned, and it was essentially how much of the Mosaic law, or in other words, the Jewish law, is going to apply to Christians. And really the question was to Gentile Christians, those Christians that were not Jewish, of Jewish background. In the early church, there was a division right away. And probably division's been one of the things that is part almost of the church since its beginning. You had those Christians that were of Jewish background, and they considered themselves still Jewish, practicing Jews. They continued going to the synagogues. They continued observing the Mosaic law. They continued observing the dietary law. And most of all, well, the circumcision that marked one as a Jewish man. They didn't see any conflict, no problem, and nobody was telling them to change anything. There was another group, the Gentile Christians. These were pagans, in other words. They were Greeks, they were Romans, they were Phoenicians, they were from all the peoples of the Mediterranean, and they had left their pagan belief and become Christian. Now, to be Christian meant to also be a little bit Jewish. I mean, it's not for nothing we have the Jewish Torah. That's part of our tradition. That's the Old Testament. And so, how much Jewish or how Jewish do you have to be when you have no Jewish background? And so came the question already. A group of them, the Pharisees, surprise, surprise, had mentioned that, well, all the newly baptized or those who follow Christ, they should be circumcised just as Jesus himself was circumcised, and Jesus is Jewish, and these first Christians are Jewish, then should everyone else follow circumcision? Now, I don't think I have to go into detail to think, do you tell that to a fully grown man what the answer is going to be? And so the question was, well, can you be Christian? Well, then who can be baptized? Who can convert? Who can accept the Lord if you're not, recently born? You don't have time to think about quickly what that really means and what it entails. And so obviously there was a problem that came in the beginning. This was the first council, really, that was assembled. They said the apostles, the presbyters, all gathered together in Jerusalem, and they had to figure out this question, the circumcision question. Could you still be Christian? Can you still be a follower of Christ? Would you be essentially baptized even though you're not circumcised? Eventually we hear the answer is yes, you can be Christian, you can be part of Christ, you can be baptized, and you do not have to go to circumcision. If you want to, that's fine, but if you don't want to, that's not a game. That's not a game changer at the end of the day. But what we see and hear in the first council is something that's kind of interesting too, kind of relevant to our times. It's the first discernment of the church. Really, a council at the end of the day is a communal discernment. It's a very long discernment. It's a very kind of stretched out discernment. But essentially, it's a discernment. And this is something I was talking to a Jesuit not too long ago, actually last week. We were talking about how the term discernment gets misused so much today. It's a buzzword. And like any buzzword, you're going to hear it over and over again, everywhere, left and right, and eventually it gets misused. It loses its meaning. It loses its punch. And discernment, unfortunately, is one of those words that has lost its punch because people use it for everything now. And amongst even Ignatian circles, we use it for everything, not really for what it's meant to be. Discernment We were talking, he said, it's certainly something serious, recalling the rules of discernment. You don't discern between an evil and a good. That's not a case of a discernment. Discernment's always between two good things, and the discernment is which one's better, which one's the magis. Both of them are things that lead you to God. Both of them are things that you're essentially called to by the Lord, and they're good in themselves. It's not the discernment between, the classic thing, between being a drug dealer and a doctor. No, there's no discernment there. But, what way am I going to serve the Lord? Well, there you go. As a doctor, or as a priest, or as a lawyer, okay, now we've got discernment in here. All things are good. But we see a lot of times discernment gets confused with the word decision. Not every decision is a discernment. Some decisions have no spiritual importance whatsoever. Some of them have no moral weight whatsoever. Some decisions, being important, being life-changing as they are, again, don't qualify discernment, because discernment, I think, is probably exercised only a few times in our lives. It's not exercised every single day. It's not exercised for every single decision or every single occasion. If we recall some of the rules from the spiritual exercises, hay decisiones inmutables. That's the time that we actually employ discernment. Those decisions which are immutable, which once taken cannot be taken back, cannot be changed. That's the case for discernment. Now, we don't often have those decisions. Those decisions that cannot be changed do not present themselves every single day. They do present themselves sometimes in our lives, a few times in our lives. Marriage, perhaps. A vocation. These are things that do not change, but they're not the same. They don't have the same weight as every decision, and certainly they do not have the same frequency. We don't decide who we're going to marry every day or every month. And so discernment becomes something very limited, something that we might dare to say even rarely exercised, because it's for a privileged moment, for a privileged decision, and not every decision qualifies for it. What does this have to do with anything? The council, the conciliar tradition of the church, and if any of my seminarians are watching, this is the answer to number 2 in the final. I'm just kidding. There were many good answers, but here's one. Here's my answer, at least. The conciliar tradition of the church is essentially discernment. And one thing that has distinguished our conciliar tradition in the Catholic Church is that it is highly irregular. How often do we have a council? We don't know. It's irregular. Sometimes you would have a council, one council would follow the other one after 4 years, even 2 years. Sometimes you've got to wait 500 years. There is no regularity to the council. Even for the Jesuit order, our general congregation, St. Ignatius of Loyola, made it very precise. It's not to be had regularly, only when necessary, and even that, rarely. And so, there have only been about 36 general congregations in the history of a 500-year-old order, essentially. Our councils, our conciliar tradition is not a regular happening. We tried to do it. In the 1400s, they passed a resolution to have a council every 3 years, eventually every 5 years, then they changed it to every 7 years, and guess what? One of the popes scrapped it. Eugene IV said, never mind. This is not the tradition of the church. A lot of the Protestant sects decided to take that up, and they have this continuous council or a reunion every so often as a regular thing. We've kind of distinguished ourselves that we don't have a regular thing. Why? Because I believe it's essentially discernment, and discernment isn't that regular. We tried it once, even the church said no. Some interpreters of Vatican II would say it's the eternal council, but that's to call it then eternal discernment. And in our circles, in Ignatian circles, eternal discernment is a bad word. So quiere decir indeciso. You cannot be an undecided person. Someone who's in eternal discernment then doesn't make a decision. And that's certainly against the whole point of discernment. You got to make a decision. You have to say yes or you have to say no. And when you say yes, make your yes mean yes and your no mean no. In some cases, some argue for an eternal discernment because they can't make a decision. And in other cases, they argue for an eternal discernment because no tienen coraje para decir no. They can't say no. Now, I'm not saying no to God is a good thing, but some men do say no to God. But even then, let your yes be a yes and your no be a no. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.